Mesa Boogie is an amp company that is synonymous with innovation and a progressive thought towards guitar amplifiers that have been pioneers of things like channel switching, the effects loop, and high gain as we know it today. Now, being a very progressive company, one of the things is they pretty rarely stop to look back on old models. They're always looking at the evolution of circuits, and with the exception of a couple of mainstays that have been around for a long time, things like the dual rectifier, the Lone Star, and the Mark series, which of course evolves on its own, there's a lot of circuits out there, a lot of amplifiers that are no longer in production, but they're still all around. And there's one amplifier in particular that I think really embodies this whole Mesa Boogie legendary evolution that even lives up to its name, and in its own way I think it represents a whole legion of Mesa Boogie amplifiers that you see out there that are lost but not forgotten. So what amp am I talking about? Well, let's hear some tones. We're going to talk a little bit about this amp, a little bit about some of these other forgotten Mesa Boogie models out there, talk a little bit about Gibson and the new acquisition. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy. So you've just seen, of course, the amp that I'm talking about is the Mesa Boogie Nomad, and the reason that I think the name is perfect for this is because I feel like these old Mesa Boogies are kind of like a nomadic group of tonal warriors. This is almost like a Greg Cauchism that I'm going down right now. They're like the dwarves of Erebor, searching for meaning after Smaug has taken their home. There are so many amplifiers out there by Mesa Boogie that, again, are no longer in production, but they're great amplifiers. And one of the reasons I call them nomadic is not just because they're no longer produced by Mesa Boogie, but because you see them used everywhere. They bounce around. They go from owner to owner. You see them in studios. You see them in trades. You see them all over the place. And it's crazy when you think about how many of these models there are. So I love the fact that this amp not only was called the Nomad, which I think represents not only its story, but the story of many other Mesa Boogie amplifiers out there, but this one in particular, I think, also represents how this company has been a little bit misunderstood. People love this amp. A lot of people hate this amp. And would you believe it if I told you that this amp, to me, is a holy grail of tone, which I'm not even sure the people at Mesa Boogie are on the same page with me on. Now, I reached out to Mesa Boogie because I heard a little bit about this amplifier, and I'm going to tell you the story of this amp in particular and my story with it in just a minute. But I reached out to Mesa Boogie and I said, I've just gotten my holy grail of tone, the Mesa Boogie Nomad. And they were great. They got right back to me, good response, gave me a little bit of info on it. But I would not be surprised at all if they were kind of going like, oh, see, new Mesa Boogie player. He's got Holy Grail. What's up? Oh, it's a Nomad. I've heard them described as the red-headed stepchild of the Mesa Boogie line. I've heard them described as amps that you just can't get a good tone out of no matter how you dial it in. Conversely, I've seen it go so far the other way that I've seen them described as, if you can't get a good tone out of this amp, you're just a bad guitar player. So there's certainly a little bit of tension going on with this model and with what this model can do. Historically speaking, I have heard a lot of players say that this one is some way a precursor to the Mark V, that it does a lot of Mark V tones, that it was kind of, somewhere in that Mesa Boogie ether before the Mark V came into being. According to Mesa Boogie themselves, this is not at all the case. The circuits are completely different, and I believe that. I definitely think that this one, tonally, is much more of a classic Mesa Boogie in the sense that, to me, it's a better representation of that hot-rodded Fender sound. Now, there's some Mesa Boogie Nomads that would be a little bit different. That would be if they have the EQ, and also if you switch over the bias and use EL34s instead of 6L6s. Now, mine does not have the EQ and it has 6L6s, but there again, you get the innovation of Mesa Boogie. You've got a little bias switch on the back. You can change out the power tubes to change the character of the amp. The EQ, the little fader EQ that they have, that's legendary in a lot of ways. This one has an effects loop. It has a recording line out before that was even really a common thing. It has crazy different voicings on each channel. Now, before we get any further into this, let's get back to a little bit more playing here. To show you this, I want to show you some clean tones. Now, this amp, for me, has been a great representation of a phrase that I like to use when it comes to dialing in your gear, which is use your ears and not your expectations. You can get great tones out of this amp as long as you dial it in the way that it sounds good and not the way that you think it should be, because this is something that plagues a lot of players. They feel like certain knobs just should be certain ways and things, and you don't use the whole range of what you have in the amplifier. So you really need to listen with your ears and put the knobs to where they sound good and not where you think they should sound good. So right now I want to show you two different tones with just the clean channel. Now, the clean channel has a classic clean channel, and then it has a pushed mode. The pushed mode really evokes that vintage, hot-rodded Fender sound, whereas the clean channel is just a great clean channel. So I'm going to use several different guitars in this video. You heard it at first with the PRS, because I think PRS and Mesa, they just go together. Not just because of Carlos Santana, of course, but PRS coming out in the 1980s, Mesa hitting their heyday really in the 80s and then into the 90s, and both of them kind of being companies that really drive towards innovation and forward thinking, and I've always associated Mesa Boogie and PRS. That being said, since they have just been acquired by Gibson, I'm also going to be playing some Gibson guitars in this. So I'm going to play some clean tones with the PRS on the regular setting, and then I'm going to switch over to the pushed setting and use a Gibson SG Classic that I've just loaded with some single tone Alnico 6 P90s. It sounds great. So check out these two vastly different tones you can get just from the green clean channel on its own. Okay, quick story about this amp with me. Now, one of the reasons I say this is a holy grail amp for me, it's not just this model, it's this exact amp. Now, when I started playing guitar, I was in college. I found out that my neighbor at my folks' place for years was a fantastic guitar player, and I had never even known this before. His name's Mark Leonard, and he was who went to Berkeley, taught music. He's an absolutely superb guitar player. He's one of the few people who can play Van Halen in a jazzy way, and he just makes it work. And this was his amplifier, this exact Mesa Boogie Nomad, because this actually isn't my first Nomad, believe it or not. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Every time I went over to play, to jam, and I put jam in quotes because like I could barely play anything. I really just went over to kind of dub along and listen to him play because he was so good. He always played into his Mesa Boogie. He also happened to be the first one I ever met who owned a real SG, which set off my love for SGs also. He had one of the old Firebrand SG, I think he still has it, one of the old Firebrand SGs. You would play that into this Mesa Boogie amp and always got the most amazing tones. And one of the things that I loved about this amp and his attitude towards the amp was, rather than hemming and hawing about a tone not being right, every time I went over, he was always excited about some new tone he was finding out of it, some new kind of sound he was working with it. And he said a couple of things that stuck with me. Number one was that the Mesa Boogie Nomad, and I think this goes for a lot of Mesa Boogie amps, the Mesa Boogie Nomad is like an instrument in itself. You not only play the guitar, you play the amp. And then, of course, one of the things he said that stuck with me very much was, man, you got to get a boogie, which I just love. It suits the way that name came about with Carlos Santana saying, man, that thing really boogies, right back from the start. Anyway, he's a huge Mesa Boogie fan. He's loved this amp for years, and I reached out to him a couple weeks ago when he found out that Gibson was buying Mesa. I just texted him and said, hey, did you hear that Gibson's buying Mesa? He said, no, you hadn't heard it yet. That's crazy. Hey, I'm selling my Nomad. And I went, what? What is this? Brings up an interesting point about them. One of the reasons that a lot of these Mesas are finding homes and not sticking around places, it's a hernia maker. This thing is crazy, crazy heavy. These things are built like Volvos, and they're not the most gig friendly in that regard unless you have kind of a crew helping you. Now, I'm not saying it's not a great gigging amp, because it is a great gigging amp, but I'm saying, for the average guitar player lugging their gear in places, this is a heavy amplifier. This is the 212. They also made a 112. They made heads and everything. He was selling this amp that I have just like revered and looked up to for years. Now, if you can believe this, I wasn't in a position where I really needed another amp, but I immediately thought, well, either Mark owns that amp or I own that amp. No one else gets to own that amp other than he or me. And to tell you the truth, I really feel like I'm just stewarding it to probably until my dying days. I will feel like this is really his amp that I'm kind of just taking care of now. Very special amp to me, having been something that I looked up to on that kind of tonal journey. Now, I mentioned it's not my first Nomad. At one point years ago, through trade, I got a Nomad just like it. Brings up another interesting point about them. Some of these were unreliable. In fact, he mentioned before he sold it to me, he didn't pull a fast one or anything, but the reverb's not working so great on this one. So actually, real quick for this video, I am running a Wampler reflection reverb and a Keeley Eccos into the effects loop. Again, Mesa Boogie with the effects loop and everything. Very, very innovative company. The one that I owned years ago had major problems with the pots. He mentioned that at one point he sent this amp back to Mesa Boogie, who completely redid the pots up to modern specs and not what they were at the time. And I have heard from a lot of people who have owned Nomads or used Nomads that they weren't the most reliable amps, that there were problems kind of like that, problems with the knobs, problems with the reverb. Later on, I also briefly owned a Mesa Boogie Nomad 11245. This is a 21255. I owned a 11245, and it was an alright amp. I wound up needing to sell it just when things got a little bit tight. That was the one that I really struggled to dial in. But again, that was before I was really using my ears to dial it in, and I was just dialing it in ways that I thought should sound good and not what actually sounded good. Great example of that. I love a lot of mid-range. I like a punchy, powerful, present mid-range in my guitar tone. That doesn't always mean cranking the mids on your amplifier. The Nomad is a crazy mid-rich amplifier, which means that you can dial the mids back quite a ways and still have a really punchy, fat, present mid-range in there. I'm so happy with this one now that I am of the knowledge of, hey, dial it in to make it just sound good and not the way you think it should sound good. That really came into play for me. For a while, I played in a function band years ago, and the amp that I used to gig with was a Marshall DSL 40C. And at one point, I was playing live with a Telecaster, and the treble was so sharp, I had to turn the treble all the way off and the presence at like 2 at live volumes, and it was plenty bright enough. When do you ever look at an amp and think to roll the treble all the way off and like that would be a usable tone? But you gotta use your ears, and that is the thing about this amplifier, is if you use your ears and dial it in, you can get some amazing, amazing tones. And again, classic Mesa Boogie tones, not just some rich, over-the-top, high-gain sound like some players like to kind of, just like, oh, Mesa, it's just overly compressed, saturating the preamp tubes. It's like, no, it's not. There's so much more to it than that, and there's so many good tones in there if you just take a minute to dial it in. So next I'm going to play this guitar. Let's check out on the drive channel. The orange channel is the one that you heard at the beginning. That one gets pretty rich and saturated. I want you to hear a much more subtle take on that one just to get a bluesy tone using a Gibson SG. You think Gibson SG and you think Mesa, and you do not think a subtle bluesy tone. Check this out. Now, I mentioned that this one was not a precursor to the Mark V, as I had heard the people at Mesa Boogie said, no, that is not the case. It's a very different circuit. Preceding it was the DC series and the F series of amplifiers, and then they said that the Nomad was kind of an offshoot before it all kind of rounded out and got to the Express series. So what I think is it's something like Carlos Santana had to go into the quantum realm, travel back in time to get one of the Infinity Stones, didn't get it back to exactly the same spot. There's an offshoot alternate timeline. That's where the Nomad comes out. Of course, if anyone could get an Infinity Stone back to where it's supposed to be, I believe it would be Carlos Santana, even though it's a ridiculous plot hole that doesn't make any sense, but that's neither here nor there. There's a whole bunch of amplifiers, again, that I think are kind of represented under that nomadic label. The DC series of amplifiers, the F series of amplifiers, the Express series of amplifiers. I see tons of those used in the past several months. I've seen at least 10 of them used regionally around, different iterations of them, and even around that there are even more. There was the Mesa Boogie Subway Blues, the Subway Rocket, the Heartbreaker. There were all kinds of amplifiers that have just been kind of forgotten. The Mesa has taken the circuits that work well, or parts of the circuits that work well, and constantly evolved them. And again, with the exception of things like the Lone Star, or the Dual Rectifier, or the Mark series, which is kind of an evolution in and of itself, there's just a lot of great amplifiers that are out there that are totally awesome amplifiers. Anytime I'd be in a situation where a Mesa Boogie is what I have to plug into, I'd kind of think like, you know what, I'm in good shape here. When I was getting into guitar, I remember some of the ones that were the current models at that time were things like the Electrodyne, the Stiletto. Not long after that came out amps like the Transatlantic, moving up to what we have nowadays, which are actually kind of going back to Mesa's roots again as far as the hot rodding Fender amp type sound, like the Fillmore, the California Tweed, but just a lot of really, really great amplifiers over the years. And I think it's cool that Mesa's so innovative and so forward-thinking, but there's part of me that's kind of like, yeah, but there's all these great amps out there that are kind of just forgotten over the years. So if you get a chance, scoop one up. Now, let's get back to a little bit more playing here. I'm going to play an aggressive rock sound from this guitar on the red channel, the Overdrive channel. And for that one, I've got it on the modern voice setting. But you'll see, again, this amplifier really goes back to that vintage kind of Mesa Boogie sound as opposed to the modern kind of chugga sound. They're sort of two dominant Mesa Boogie sounds. There's the inspired by the vintage, the hot rodded Fender, the singing sustain, the rich kind of classic rock sound, and then the point of divergence would have been the Mark II C+, which is the one that really launched high gain. It really launched a whole different guitar sound that really defined genres. Let's check out what this thing can do with a little bit more drive on that third channel, but again, show you how this one really represents that vintage tone. Now, in closing, I obviously made a joke about it in the thumbnail. You want to know the truth? I don't have anything to say about Gibson's acquisition of Mesa other than let's give it a chance. If this were 4 or 5 years ago, before the big Gibson shakeup, so to speak, I would have had a very bleak outlook on it. Nowadays, I think Gibson, based on what they've done with the company, what they're doing with the company, I think they've at least earned the right to say, you know what, let's see what happens, because I think they're on the way to right the ship based on what I've seen from models. This is not a paid thing, but I've never spoken to anyone at Gibson Guitars before. I love Gibson Guitars for their classic look, feel, tone. As a player, it doesn't mean that I've always agreed with everything they've done as a company. It's just something that as a player, they're models that I've watched my guitar heroes play, tones that I've just loved. And I want to believe that the marriage between Mesa and Gibson is going to work. Right now, I don't see anything that spells doom and gloom. I have seen a lot of people, kind of make crass comments about, well, get ready for the prices to shoot up and everything. But, you want to know the truth? First of all, Gibson's prices have been a little bit more reasonable since the shakeup. And the other thing is Mesas have never exactly been cheap. Now, I'm not saying that in a way that they're overpriced. I don't think they're overpriced. I think they're great amplifiers, but they're certainly not inexpensive amplifiers either. So for those of you who are Mesa fans, first of all, if you see any of these old models out there, scoop them up, because they're great amps. If you have an opportunity to trade for one, if you have an opportunity to play one, try them out. And again, just give it a minute to dial in, because Mesas tend to have a lot of knobs. There's certainly a couple of models that didn't have as many knobs, but the Mesas with a lot of knobs, those knobs are there for a reason. So if you just take a couple of minutes and really try and dial it in and play around with it, there are some amazing tones in there that you can find. The amps deserve more than just, plugging in and setting it the way you think it should go, and then just, it just doesn't work. Mesas are overpriced, and they do this. No, there's some great tones in there. You just gotta, sometimes, depending on the guitar, depending on the situation, you just got to play with it a little bit until you find the right tone for you. So let us know in the comments, do you have a Nomad? There's a lot of you out there, I know, who have a Nomad. Do you have one of these other amps? Do you have one of the DC series? Do you have one of the F series? Do you have an Express? The other Mesa Boogie amp that I briefly owned that I really regret getting rid of was a Studio Caliber 22. Oh, I really want one of those, and I really want one of the Subway Blues. And the thing that's tricky about them is they only show up every now and again. but they always kind of show up, one model or another. Right now, I think there's an Express that's listed used. There's an F30, I want to say, that's listed used. There's a Subway Blues a couple hours away from me that's listed used. You see other Express series amps. You see some of the Recto Verbs. Are you a Mesa player? Do you own Mesa? Do you own a Nomad, or do you own one of these other models? Let us know in the comments. We're going to close out with just one last clean tone using this guitar. Again, we'll try and send them off with some nice clean tones, Gibson and Mesa. Wish them the best of luck. Again, two brands that I just absolutely love, and I don't want to be one of those people who just pish-poshes it and, almost wants it to fail so that I can pish-posh it more. I want them to succeed. I want them to keep making great stuff. I want them to make even better stuff in the future. I want them to live up to what their names have represented over the years. So I'm Jack Fossett. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to hear all these guitars on some studio recordings, make sure you follow the link below and follow me on Spotify. You can hear my guitars and my amplifiers on studio recordings that I do. Let us know what you think in the comments. Let us know about your Mesa Boogie amp experience. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.